So welcome everyone to this webinar organized by Evidentic. My name is Hilda Teixeira and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Evidentic, and I'll be the monitor for this webinar today. So as you can see, our topic is Ready for Remote, eCOA and EDC. So this webinar will consist of the following parts: a brief introduction, followed by the rise of remote, EDC and eCOA requirements in hybrid trials. And then it will finish with some conclusions and time for a Q&A session. Our speaker today will be Andreas Weber. He is the CEO at Evidentic. Andreas has worked for the past 25 years as an executive in life science space. He has headed the global portfolio sales and business development teams at ERT. He was former leader of the APAC and EU sales team at Bioclinica, and he has had former leadership roles at Oracle Health Science. So now it is my pleasure to pass you the mic, Andreas, and the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Hilda, and also warm welcome from my side for everybody. So I'm really pleased that you have been taking the time today. For today, I think we should actually look at some takeaways. So what do we want to achieve with this webinar today? What I really want you is to understand how best-in-class hybrid trials can be run. I also would like you to take away how eCOA in combination with EDC can really power your trial data collection. And I also want you to learn how EDC and eCOA can be used as the foundation or as a nucleus really for any decentralized or hybrid trial. Next slide, please. Looking a little bit about the context where remote is coming from. Everybody is aware we just went through the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously has been a little bit an accelerator or trigger for all of that, what we're going to be discussing today. There's also been a lot of changes in the regulatory framework driven by the FDA, but then also by the EMA in Europe. There are new technologies. There's a lot of new digital health technologies available via mobile apps, which can be used for the transmission of data. What we also have seen in the course of the pandemic is that there has been an increase in telehealth and home nursing networks and all things like that that can really help patients in clinical trials to participate in a remote way. There has been new FDA guidances about the use of real-world data in clinical trials. So the FDA is now encouraging any sponsor to use real-world data coming from patients directly for their submissions. And finally, there's also an increased demand for interoperability between healthcare and life sciences. If you look at electronic health records, for example. So that all means actually DCTs, so decentralized trials or hybrid trials, are increasing. It's basically the rise of this concept, what we're experiencing since the pandemic, but also beyond. Looking at some statistics, according to the Everest Group, 90% of the industry will actually incorporate at least one element of a hybrid or decentralized trials in their clinical trials going forward by the year 2024. 39% is actually the number by which clinical trials that have at least one virtual components have been increasing compared to 2021. And if you're looking at e-consent, which is obviously a very important part of any decentralized or hybrid trial, there we look at an increase in the use of e-consent of 460% compared to 2020. And that all means together that we are now looking at a market size for decentralized trials of about 1.6 million by 2027, according to precision reports. Next slide, please. So what we're also looking at, there's an increased need for real-world data evidence generation. If you look a little bit back in the years before the pandemic, real-world evidence was always a factor in the industry, but real-world evidence has been mainly used for different purposes, not for clinical trials. Real-world evidence has been collected for example, observational purposes in post-marketing studies. It has been also collected for market access studies, where a sponsor would like to find out how the new drug or the new device should be positioned in the market. Now, over the last 2 years, there have been several new guidances which are really saying sponsors should collect real-world data also in the context of their clinical trials, being it to the extreme that it can be even used to run a placebo arm completely virtually via real-world evidence collection. But it can be also that real-world evidence is actually used in conjunction with classical clinical data that gets collected in order to prove how patients are feeling about the study, how patients are feeling about the burden of their disease, and things like that. So real-world data, in essence, may be used for informing on the patient journey, discovering unmet needs of the patients, the quality of care, the burden of their disease, and things like that. But it's also used for assessing the value of treatment from the patient perspective, which might be different than the outcome of pure clinical data. And it also might be used how obviously how the drug or the medicine entering the market is actually used by the patients and how they feel about the treatment once it has been marketed. Next slide, please. So what are really the benefits when we are running a trial in a hybrid or in a fully decentralized way compared with a classical site approach? Well, it's about being faster. It's about increasing data quality. And the most important one, it's about having a more patient-centric approach. So by running a trial in a hybrid or decentralized fashion, we can actually reduce the constraints and burden for the patient to go too often to a site. We can also increase with that the success rate to enroll and keep also patient enrolled in the study. That means we should actually be able to decrease the dropout rate, which constantly is a problem in the industry. We should also be able to increase diversity in clinical studies. And as probably everybody knows, the FDA has been putting out some new guidances, which are really encouraging, not only encouraging, but enforcing having the right diversity of patients in a clinical study. I have actually seen studies that have been submitted and they got rejected because the diversity of the patients was not given in the trial as expected. It's also about enhanced data collection from patients directly, since actually the ePRO or the direct-to-patient approach is the heart of any hybrid or decentralized trial. And it's about engaging patients with a study design and the way it's conducted, because a successful study can only be delivered once the patients understand the study and actually are willing to promote it. Next slide, please. So what does that all mean a little bit now for EDC and eCOA, which is the topic of our webinar today? Before we going a little bit deeper into those areas, what I want to show you how a typical value chain or typical workflow of a hybrid or decentralized trial might look like. So if you're starting actually on the upper left-hand side of that graph that you can see right now, it's all about actually identifying potential patients for a clinical trial. And we can use different sources to do so, to identify potential patients. We can use Facebook, we can use Google, we can use different health websites, we can use our Carenity platform to find patients. And once patients have been identified, we would actually go on and pre-screen them. That's the next step in a typical workflow. Patients will be pre-screened with an online pre-screening questionnaire. Once that has been done, the successful patients will actually move into a virtual inclusion visit. That visit can actually be conducted via teleconference. The important thing is that at this point in time, we need to collect the consent from the patient, and that typically is done with a state-of-the-art e-consent application. A state-of-the-art e-consent application usually also has some video capabilities. And it has also the capabilities for the physician to show the patient documents like PowerPoints or maybe even a movie, because it's important and it's actually mandated by the authorities, FDA and EMA, that an informed discussion has actually happened. So that the physician has passed on all the required information to the patient. And that happens in those applications. Once that has actually happened, so the information of the patients and the consent will be loaded into the EDC application. And there the patients will be randomized. Once the patients are randomized, we can actually start with the data collection activities. Now, in a hybrid trial, it might look a little bit different than in a traditional trial. The centerpiece, as you can see there, is indeed the eCOA application, because a lot is about self-reported data by patients. The self-reported data can be collected by ePROs, so by patient-reported outcomes. It can be also collected by eDiaries. eDiaries mean actually that a patient fills in certain information on a regular basis, so once a day or twice a day, whereas an ePRO is usually ad hoc. But then what also becomes more important, and that is what you can see on the left-hand side of the big green box at the bottom of this graph, is real-time data coming from variables, coming from sensors, coming from emotional biomarkers. And finally, if you're looking at the right-hand side actually of that big green box, we will find also then classical data, which is collected still also in hybrid or in decentralized trials. That data can be collected via sites, but it can be also collected via remote visits or via teleclinics. All that data gets captured actually in the EDC system, and the EDC system has to be able, first of all, to acquire all that data, but then also to bring it all together, to recognize different standards and be able to transform those standards into the SDTM standards which are required for the submission of the study by the authorities. So after that data collection part of the study, what happens is the usual data management activity, the safety management, and the biostats stats. And then obviously there are a lot of deliverables created, which will be submitted as for any trial to the authorities, like the clinical report, including the TFLs, statistical analysis scripts, the raw data, and the scientific communication. Next slide, please. So what does that mean really now for EDC and eCOA systems? If we want to think about that, we want to use potentially DCT, or we want to run a DCT, or we want to use at least some elements to run a hybrid trial. What I would like to tell you today is that you should watch out what requirements your EDC must fulfill, because not every EDC is actually made for a hybrid or decentralized trial. The classic functionality of the EDC is obviously twofold. It's a container for all data that gets collected, but then also an engine that transforms that data into the standards, the CDIS standards, which are required for the submission of the data. So apart from the classical function, which you can see in this big gray bubble, which is called EDC in this graph, the EDC should also have different functionality. For example, we have been talking about e-consent, which is an important part of it. We have been talking about, obviously, ePRO, which is also important for any hybrid trial. So actually, those functionalities should be part or connected to the EDC. In an ideal case, there should be actually a natural integration so that those applications can talk to each other. I've seen actually customers trying to work with those on a hybrid trial, and they've been trying to match many different systems together from different vendors, which are not integrated. They've been trying to integrate them, which obviously will create a huge element of complexity on the trial, and that is not what is actually a good way to success. Other areas probably we need to look at is also variables integration. As we've been just describing in the slide before, it's all about also integrating data from different sources. Variables, sensors, biomarkers becoming more and more important. So the EDC system needs to have a connector, not only an API, but the system also needs to be in a position or needs to be able to work with the data, to read it and to transform it. We have been also talking about the importance of the eCOA. So when we are working with eCOA, it's actually important that the EDC is able to push dictionaries and questionnaires to devices. We also said that the e-consent should have actually video conference capabilities. And if you're thinking about patient centricity, it's becoming also more and more important to make it easy for the patient to enter data into an eCOA or into an ePRO tool. So that means the eCOA or ePRO tool should be actually able to have different designs. For example, with image-based data entry, where a patient has to click on icons or on the shape of a body instead of actually entering a long text or long numeric values. What is finally also very important for any hybrid trial is a reporting aspect of it, because we are getting a lot of different data from different sources together, and we need to make sure that the quality of that data is sound. And that is actually possible if we have a good BI tool, which again is connected, in an ideal case, actually fully integrated with the EDC solution. Next slide, please. So what we can see is actually, as I try to explain a little bit, is a shift from what I would say EDC with standard features to an EDC with additional features. Standard features, that is what you can see on this slide on the left-hand side. So it's basically supporting what we've been saying. It's supporting the classical EDC workflow. We've got data extraction features and options. We've got an audit trail. We've got queries and reports. We've got subject status tracking, and so on and so on. But that is not sufficient anymore in the remote world. In the remote world, we need a little bit more. And that is shown on the right-hand side of this slide. So what is very, very important, as we mentioned already, is electronic signatures. So that needs to be a capability of the EDC system. It also needs to work with scheduling alerts and reminders and notifications, because we are working a lot with the patients directly together. Sometimes we don't have the sites in between, so we need to work with the patient. We need to have some means to communicate with the patients, and we are doing that with those alerts. Those alerts shouldn't be just in the application itself. There should be a possibility to send text messages, SMS messages to the patient, or emails, or WhatsApp messages, for example. No need to say that an EDC system in a remote world should be also multilingual, because obviously our goal is that we include a bigger diversity of patients. So we will actually have patients potentially from different parts of the world. So the system needs to be multilingual. We also need to be able to visit, to schedule visits and task lists, because this is also again important in the remote world, because we won't have the sites in between us and the patient necessarily. Finally, we also need to be able to have the ability for data verification and data monitoring. And that should be also one of the advanced features of an EDC that is ready for remote. Next slide, please. Here I give you actually an example how data-based data can be actually collected based on images. I mentioned before to you that this is actually such a design is becoming more important for data entry in traditional trials, but even the more in hybrid or decentralized trials. Why is that again? Nobody likes to enter a lot of text or a lot of numeric values. If you think about a patient, right, and specifically if you're working with a diary and you're asking the patient to fill twice a day or even 3 times a day certain information into a e-diary, then you may need to make the life for the patient as easy as possible. And if you, for example, have a pain study and you ask the patient, where is your pain today, this morning and this evening, then it's by far easier for the patient just to click actually on a certain body part in this shape instead of providing a description. It's also better for us, right? Because at the end of the day, it's more easier to evaluate that data and to analyze the data later on. So a good EDC application or an eCOA application that actually allows image-based data entry is clearly favorable for any hybrid or decentralized trial. The way it works is the patient would actually click on this part of the body, and that would be linked to a set of values. And we would collect that set of value just via that click. We could even include in the EDC the capability to zoom on the image and to have a more granular approach to that. So if we look at the hand, that we have actually different zones on each finger the patient could look at. So actually there's no end in how granular we could go with that approach. Next slide, please. And actually, what is extremely important as well for any hybrid or decentralized trial is that the EDC suite has connections. We are living in a connected world, and in a remote world, connections are becoming even more important. So some examples I've got actually on that slide. I'm starting on the top. So the EDC suite should actually be able also to reward patients. For example, there can be a connection with a provider of digital gift cards. I put in here ribbon, but it could be also linked to Amazon or any other provider. But it's important that actually the EDC system provides that connection and can work with it. What is also important that we connect it with Salesforce. Most of the companies in our industry, most of pharmaceutical companies and CROs are actually using Salesforce as their CRM tool. And it's important actually that we have an integration between the EDC and the CRM tool. I mentioned already alerts to patients, but maybe also to other participants in the study. Nowadays, a lot of people are using WhatsApp. So I believe it's very important to have a connection to use WhatsApp. It's also important that there are actually connections to diagnostics. And I put here Brighton collaboration diagnostics as an example, but there can be others as well. I think there should be a connection with the diagnostics tool. SMS is also important for push messages to send out to the patients, but also potentially to other participants in the study, like investigators and study nurses. And finally, we have been talking about the data collection activities. And nowadays, a lot of trials have actually an element where data is collected via variables, via sensors, via biomarkers. And that actually also means an integration for those tools need to be part of the EDC suite. And again, the integration doesn't mean only that the EDC tool has to be able to read that data and to load it into the EDC. It has to be able also to be able to transform that data into the standards that are required by the regulatory agencies for submissions. And two things about healthcare interoperability. That is also becoming more and more important for any trial, not only in the remote world. So what is important is that we have a means to collect data, to load data from electronic health records. And that means, again, for the EDC system, there should be a connector that is actually able to work with different data formats. As we all know, very unfortunately for the industry, but it's a matter of fact, data formats of electronic health records are different in different countries and in different geographies. And the EDC system needs to be able to cope with that, because I actually see that electronic health record data will become more and more important going forward for any clinical trial in the remote world and even for traditional trials. If you're thinking about a recruitment, nowadays it's becoming also more and more important for recruitment to check actually the eligibility of a patient against the electronic health record. And that can only happen if we have some means and some connectors that we can read that data, that we can get it out of the hospital environment into our EDC, and that we can work with that data there. Next slide, please. The other aspect, what both eCOA and EDC need to deliver in our remote world is actually patient engagement. So we have been talking a lot already about the recruitment of patients and the workflow, how we can do that in a digital way without losing any data, so that we can, from identifying the patients to setting them up in the EDC, that we can conduct all of those activities via one seamless digital workflow without any manual interference. Now it's also about keeping those patients really engaged. And how can we get the patient engaged? We need to make sure that the applications that are patient facing, like the eCOA, like the ePRO, like the eDiary, has an easy navigation, that it has basically a design that the patients like to work with, that it can create more visually interesting questionnaires or designs, again, that the patients like to work with. One word or one big buzzword in the industry is always gamification. So I wouldn't not say gamification is what we should do with eCOA, but we should actually make it interesting for the patient to work with, so that there's an additional incentive. Patient recruitment is something which we want to accelerate. And a novel way to recruit patients digitally is also by using an eCOA application. So what is actually possible is that we have like a link in a questionnaire. The patient clicks on it, and that would actually direct the patient to a landing page. On the landing page, a patient would actually fill in a pre-screening questionnaire. And once that has been filled in, the patient would be again directed to the the consent application, where the consent for the participation in the trial can actually be collected from the patient, and where the patient can be informed about the trial and then finally being enrolled. That all needs to be actually be part of the eCOA and the EDC of the future, to play a role in the remote world. We also want to retain the patients actually on the trial. One of the goals, if you remember my previous slides, is to decrease the dropout rate of patients. So we want to increase the retention. We're doing that in the remote world naturally by limiting or reducing the travel time to sites, but it's also about interactive options for the patients to take part in the study. The more interactions we actually include in our eCOA and in our EDC design with the patients, where we have a direct approach to the patients, the better will it be for the study, because the patients will be more interested in staying on the study and not dropping out. So one approach is also an anonymous service, so that with anonymous service, we can actually see how a wider group of patients would actually react. So we can reach a by far wider group of respondents. What is important in all of that is also that we reduce, obviously, the study cost. I mean, as you remember, that was one of the goals we want to achieve in the remote world. And we can do that via virtual visits versus on-site visits. But we can do it also by reducing administrative and monitoring cost. And we can reduce it by making sure that patients can actually connect to devices, not only to the eCOA, but also to wearable devices, and that we can collect data that way. In all of that, it is very, very important that we have the ability to ensure also our data quality. Remote collecting in the remote world, collecting data is all about quality. We want to digitalize, and digitalization means that we're taking the human error element out, but we also need to have actually some means to check it. And that means that we need to have an analytic way of looking at data. And that's also one of the main requirements for an EDC and for an eCOA in the remote world. Next slide, please. So I'm coming now to the conclusions. What does it mean for us all in a nutshell or in a summary? We've been looking at decentralized trials. We've been looking at hybrid trials. I do strongly believe that hybrid trials, based also on the figures I've been showing you initially, will be the way to conduct trials in the future. Fully decentralized centralized trials are still a little bit rare, but there are some, and there are some that have been successfully submitted to the authorities that have been approved already. And there will be also more, but obviously not every trial is made to be run in a complete decentralized mode. Just think about a trial which is like image heavy, where you need to get CTs from a patient on a regular basis. Those trials are probably not made for a full DCT approach, but more for hybrid approach. So what we learned before, probably more than 90% of trials over the next years will have at least one hybrid element. And I believe the number of hybrid elements will be actually growing and growing. And that obviously puts a lot of focus on EDC, eCOA, and eConsent. We have been talking about, the patient-centric or the patient-engaging technologies, home nursing networks, teleclinics, and all of that. That is important for a hybrid trial, but it's even more important to have a good foundation, the EDC as a container and as a transformation engine to work with all that data, and obviously the eCOA and eConsent as our means to reach out to the patients. Remember, those will be actually the direct interfaces we're going to have with the patients. Next slide, please. So what makes then the building blocks for a remote trial, for a hybrid trial? What are the important elements I would like you to take away from that webinar today? So first, open APIs in the EDC to load data really from various sources, being it electronic health records, being it sites, being it real-world evidence or real-world data, being it variables or biomarkers. That is the first important building block. When we're moving to the right, then it's also then important to have an EDC with enhanced features for sites and for patients, which are fully integrated with eCOA and eConsent. Remember the slide I've been showing you with all those different bubbles? I think all of those elements are increasingly important for a successful trial in the remote world. The healthcare interoperability features also becoming more and more important, because we will need in the future more and more work with electronic health record data, but also with pharmacy data coming from insurances, from claims databases, etc. We need to be able to and have the capacity to link, transform, and analyze the data from all those different sources in the EDC. That is our fourth building block. Our fifth one is the inclusion of real-world evidence data, enabling increased patient access and patient centricity. So I think also over the next years, it will not be sufficient to deliver in the submission of a trial just the traditional medical data we have been collecting for all those years. As the FDA guidances are demanding, we will also need to deliver a set of real-world data which is actually giving an indication about how the patients are feeling about the study, how the patients are feeling about the burden of their disease, how the patients are feeling about the potential treatment, and what are they expecting from any treatment. That is actually now what the FDA and also the EMA is expecting, in addition to the traditional data we are submitting for any clinical trial. And finally, the last building block is really the integration with patient recruitment to allow for an e-enrollment workflow. Remember when I've been showing you that workflow for a, let me say, ideal hybrid or decentralized trial. The recruitment part of it becomes more and more important because actually the recruitment is a bottleneck. And traditionally, we have been working with recruitment agencies, which would actually refer a patient, but I don't believe in the remote world that's good enough. In the remote world, we actually need to have a seamless digital workflow from the identification of the patient on different platforms to the enrollment in the EDC system. So That was my last slide. I will give you a little bit more information about Evidentic before we can move into the Q&A section. So in essence, we at Evidentic are a company that is combining data and technology. We are, I think, pioneers in that area because we are bringing data and technology together. We do have a full suite of eClinical products. We're calling it our eClinical platform, which is actually integrated. And on this suite, you will find an EDC with the advanced features, which I've been showing you today, but it also contains randomization and trial support management. It also includes CTMS, it includes eTMF, EISF, we've got ePRO, eCOA, we've got eConsent, medical coding, remote monitoring, risk-based monitoring, and payments, and many, many more. We are combining that with our own platform of patients. We are running at the same time a patient community, which has more than 500,000 patients on it, covering all the countries in Europe, but also the United States. We're covering more than 1,000 chronic diseases. And we can use that platform to recruit patients, to generate real-world evidence for clinical trials, for market access trials, for observational trials, and we're using it as well just for feasibility studies to support our customers with their protocol and with their study design. We can link data, we can transform data, we can analyze data from different sources. We are supporting full DCTs, but also hybrid trials. And we are supporting customers generally with a generation of real evidence for clinical trials. That was my last slide. Many thanks. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andres. That was really, really interesting. And we do have a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to start reading them to you. Yeah, so I don't know if we're going to have the time to go through all of them, guys, because we only have 20 minutes left and there's a lot of questions. But if not, then we will send you some of the answers. So the first one is, how may we ask a patient to undergo a screening without having signed the informed consent?
Right, there are actually two consents, and maybe I was misleading a little bit how I explained it. For pre-screening, the patient needs to sign a consent just for that exercise, just for the pre-screening exercise. The second part then is the informed consent, where another consent is collected from the patient in order to have the patient enrolled in the study. So how can we collect the first one? I believe that was a question. The consent for the pre-screening. It basically depends pretty much on where do we pre-screen the patient and where do we find the patient. On our Kernity platform, we have actually a consent of all of our members that we can talk to them, that we can contact them. So we would actually send them a form and ask them to give us a consent to direct them to a landing page where the pre-screening will take part. A similar approach can be actually obviously also applied to any other source, to any, let me say, website, patient forum, where we might want to contact patients.
Thank you. Next question is, what regulatory approvals are required for decentralized and hybrid trials?
There are no regulatory approvals as such. If you look at the latest guidances over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of digital ways to run trials by the FDA, then you would see the FDA have actually created a digital framework. You can look it up at the FDA website, and that framework tells you how the FDA is looking at digitalization for a trial. So what they see as kind of accepted and what they don't see as accepted. So that framework actually is something I would suggest to consult before starting with a trial design. If you considering running a full DCT, I would actually also suggest that once you have basically a synopsis ready, to get in touch with the FDA and to ask them for some feedback. Usually you can send it to the FDA, to the EMA, same thing. I'm just saying FDA, but it can be the same with the EMA. You can send it to them, and then you can actually have an appointment with them where they will actually guide you to what they think about the design, and they will give you probably some ideas what you need to change. But again, there's no regulatory approval to run a hybrid trial or DCT as such. It's more about accepting and working within the framework of the FDA or the EMA. And then my suggestion is definitely send them the synopsis or the protocol once ready, and ask them for their feedback.
Perfect. So next question is, how are local laboratory results incorporated into the database, and how is the data reviewed for safety?
Okay, so local lab data should actually also be ending up in the EDC system. If you remember again that page with all the bubbles, I believe there was also one with basically a lab connector. So state-of-the-art EDC systems can actually load data from pretty much any sources, lab data from pretty much any sources into the EDC and work with it there. So that is, how I would basically see the connection. And the second part of the question was around safety, Gilda?
Yeah, sorry, my was yeah. So how is it can it incorporate into the database, and how is the data reviewed for safety? Yeah.
Okay, I mean, at the end of the day, when it's in the database, when it's like kind of in the EDC database, then obviously that data also needs to be reviewed by the investigator. So that is an activity which actually takes part once the data has been loaded into the EDC.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, what does API stand for, as in Open API in EDC?
API stands for Advanced Programming Interface. It's a technical term. And that actually means it's a connector. It's a pre-built connector. It's like, you can imagine it like a software tool that can be configured. So you can have a little connector. And that's called API. Let me say we've been talking a lot about electronic health records. So you have basically a hospital, and you want to load data from the electronic health records into the EDC and make it applicable to your clinical trial. So then you need a connector. The connector is a piece of software, which is called again API, Advanced Programming Interface, that you can configure so that it can read the data out of the hospital and transform it into the data that is required in the EDC.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, do you have customized source for clinical site to use as a protocol required information is captured?
Sorry, can you read that again?
Yeah, and do you have customized source for clinical site to use as protocol required information is captured? I think it's not really clear.
I don't really understand the question. Maybe
Yeah.
the person who has asked it can clarify a little bit.
Yeah, please. Okay, we will go to the next one if and on the meantime. So there's another person who says, we speak about e-consent and most of the things done virtually. Is it not important that the patient is actually seen, examined in person before enrolling him, her?
I believe that depends pretty much on the therapeutic area and on the trial. I believe in some therapeutic areas that is very, very important that the patient is examined and has still the direct contact with a physician. If you take, for example, some oncology trials, experience has shown that the patients are expecting that that contact with that direct contact with the patient. And I think in those trials, quite often it's important that there's still a site element, and examination visit still takes place at the site. But think about some other therapy areas. For example, diabetes or skin disease is also a good example. those are actually more made for a DCT or hybrid approach, or even more for a DCT approach. Because think about it, the skin disease patient has a skin disease. Let me say there are some red areas at the arm. um, the patient does not need to be examined, at a site level. It's quite often sufficient that a photo is actually just taken by the patient of that red area on his arm, and the patient sends actually that photo to the physician. And then what can happen is there can be actually an online consultation, and the physician can talk it through with the patient. Or that information can be collected via eCOA with a patient-reported outcome questionnaire, where the patient can say, "Look, I mean, I've got this red area here. It's itching, it's scratching, or it hurts." And then we can have actually some scales, how much it hurts and where it hurts exactly, and we can collect information like that. And the patient could attach a photo to it, and that's something then actually the physician can evaluate. And if more, let me say, discussion is required, then that can happen via a teleconference.
Okay, great. So next questions is, many people may not be very tech friendly, especially the older generation. Is it not a disadvantage?
It depends. I mean, partly I would say whoever asked that question is right. The older population is not that tech savvy as a younger population, and actually sometimes even operating like a smartphone is a problem for elderly people. And actually there are also different concepts. One concept, for example, to collect data from elderly people is via so-called caregivers, right? So that could be via relatives. It could be also via a nurse that is visiting the elderly person anyway. So what I'm trying to say is the data doesn't need to be entered directly by that elderly person. It could be also by a caregiver, which is close to the elderly person. But again, I think I understand where the question is coming from, and my answer would be again, we have been talking about decentralized trials and hybrid trials, and my philosophy is, or my opinion is, that going forward we will see a rapid increase in hybrid trials, not necessarily that much in fully decentralized trials. And that is exactly one of the reasons, because in a hybrid trial, we could actually still have, elderly people having coming to sites to collect data from them over there. Whereas maybe we could combine it with the way that we still collect some patient-reported outcome data via then a mobile phone or via the computer or via tablet, but it's not entered by that elderly person, but by the caregiver. And it also basically shows us that we need to make the technology as easy as possible. So therefore, I was also pointing out a few times today that the technology should be extremely patient friendly. It should be intuitive. Nobody should need to know anything about IT really to enter, certain answers, certain data.
That's right. So there's another question. How do you make sure that patient identifying information cannot be extracted from the data to ensure GDPR compliance?
That's a very important question as well, because obviously in all what we said, we didn't talk too much about GDPR so far, but data needs to be obviously GDPR compliant. And that is something the authorities and the regulators will look at. So actually how we are doing it at our company, we are encrypting the data. So all the data that is collected is actually encrypted in the database at the database level. And that's an important thing, because that ensures that only people who should be able to see that data can see the data. Not even everybody who is part of the study team can actually see that data. And like that, with this encryption, we are making sure that we are GDPR compliant. And I was saying this is an important question, because this is also what I would recommend everybody to watch out for when evaluating EDC, eCOA, and eConsent applications and the connection in between them.
Perfect. I think we have the person, who we couldn't understand the question. So, how will the site know the flow of data to be captured? Typically, sites use source document worksheets as not everything is in EMR. Many things are protocol specific.
Yeah, I mean, from a site perspective, the site obviously will, in a hybrid trial, still play an important role. And yes, from a site perspective, it's all source document related. But we were talking about also the workflow and how, let me say, the EDC, the process flow, the workflow, how this is actually built in the EDC. And I think it's important that the EDC has also the capability to include the sites in that. The sites have also access to that application, to that EDC application, and they have actually the opportunity to see where they are and what points of the workflow they are, right? And still, as we discussed in a hybrid trial, the sites still play a role. And I think it's not much different from that source data approach, which is a traditional one. So actually, what is at the site level would happen, the site personnel would enter the source data, or basically via an integration with the EDC system, would enter or make sure that the source data is actually coming into the EDC application as well. A state-of-the-art EDC application has actually the mean to integrate also, or to read source data into the EDC system. And I think that is actually what needs to happen then also at the site level. And again, the site personnel is also part of the study team and therefore is part of the EDC workflow. So it would look like source data is actually collected at the site level. The source data gets loaded into the EDC system, and then it depends really if there's a remote investigator or if the investigator is still at the site level. The investigator would analyze the data in the EDC at the site. If it's at site level, then in the EDC application at the site. If it's a remote investigator, the remote investigator would look at that data in the EDC, but would obviously be remote.
Perfect. So we have a last question. Oh, I think we have two. Okay. Well, when does Evidentic plan to offer a fully integrated eCOA solution?
Evidentic already has a fully integrated eCOA solution. The eCOA solution we are providing is actually part of our EDC, and it's already fully integrated.
Okay.
So it's now. It's available now.
Yeah. And now, the last question. Who is your target market or sponsor?
Our target market is actually the mid-market. We are working with CROs. We are working with sponsors directly. We are working with medical device companies. We're working with drug sponsors. We're working with a lot of academic institutions. We're working with some non-profit organizations as well. So all of that is our market. And we have many customers in all of those different areas, quite often very long-term customers, very loyal customers. But we are focusing pretty much on the mid-market. Why is that? Because I'm a strong believer that it's a good combination. It's always a good partnership between two mid-sized companies. We are a mid-sized company, and most of our customers are also mid-sized companies. We have a very personalized approach with our customers. We're actually building partnerships rather than seeing a customer-vendor relationship. And a partnership means actually that we intend to work together with our customers over a long period in time. That means also that we are listening to them. That means also that in our organization, they're not a number, but actually they are a face. And they have a face at our organization. We have a customer success team, and every customer gets allocated a customer success manager. That is a person with a face. That is a person they can meet in person. They can phone, they can have a video conference with, and they can actually discuss any topic with. So that's like the entry point into the Evidentic organization for our customers. And I really like this personal relationship. And therefore, we are focusing predominantly on the mid-market. Having said that, we have a few larger CRO customers and pharma customers as well, where we also established this relationship. But again, we predominantly we are mid-market company, and we are working a lot together with mid-market sponsors and CROs and academic institutions.
Okay. We're still getting questions, but we're running out of time, guys. So I don't know, Andreas, we have time for one last question.
Yeah, one or two more.
Yeah, and then we will be contacting you if to answer the rest of the questions. So we have a question: how many companies are using Evidentic in the US right now?
Wow, that is a good question. I don't have the exact number on the top of my head. That's something we need to follow up with, but I would think probably the number is around 50.
No. Okay, and then I think that we have another question about how to validate questionnaires. Maybe that's longer to answer. How do you validate your questionnaires?
How do you validate questionnaires? I mean, we are working a lot with standard questionnaires, which is actually the easiest, because nowadays there are so many pre-validated questionnaires for almost any trial and any purpose. In any trial, and that is actually our preferred way. It's very, very rare that we need to build a questionnaire from scratch. If we have to do so, then we would actually work with one of our partners for the validation part of it. And we have actually many partners who can do that for us. But in essence, my recommendation would be to use a pre-validated standard questionnaire, which usually should be able to cater for almost any study design.
Okay, thank you. So I think that we have a little bit more questions, but we will answer them via email, guys, we promise. So again, thanks everyone for sending your questions. Thanks for attending this webinar. Thank you, Andreas, for all your expertise and insight on this. If anyone has more questions about Evidentic and our solutions, feel free to contact us. And for access to the replay, you will be getting an email from us to have access to this replay and hence the slides. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day and goodbye.
Thank you so much for your time.
Bye.
Goodbye.